I'm so excited to be here with all of you this afternoon. We know that we're in an interesting time, and the fact that you've chosen to spend this time with us, it's not lost on us. We're very honored to have you here for this session. So I want to go ahead and launch us into a welcome to the series, and then I'll move us on to talking about today's session in particular. So welcome to the CAAASA UCLA CCEE Advancing Equity in an Era of Crisis webinar series. The California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, CAAASA, and the University of California, Los Angeles Center for the Transformation of Schools put this project together to support equity in virtual learning as we all shelter in place to prevent the spread of COVID-19. This work has been made possible by the generous support of the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, CCEE. We are grateful for their partnership on behalf of California's K-12 public school students. At the end of the session today is this live session that we're in right now, I will ask you to complete a survey to evaluate our time together, because it's really important for us to receive your feedback and make sure we're really meeting the needs of our participants. So I'll share the links to the survey at the end of our session. This session is also being recorded, so if you're watching the recording later, you'll still be able to access the survey, and we would love for you to fill that out as well. Additionally, I'm going to talk in a second about how interactive we would like for this session to be and how we want that to look. But if for some reason there are questions that come up for you after today's session, or that you feel like you didn't have answered by today's session, we've also created an Ask the Experts portal for you, where you'll be able to submit your questions, and then within 48 hours, an expert will get back to you with an answer to your question. And so I'll also share the link to that portal at the end of the session. And then finally, as far as the links that I'll send, there's also a website where the sessions resources from today's session will be available, the slide presentation, the recording. I'll send that link to you as well at the end. One of the things I want to keep in mind for today is that we want to make sure that as we're going through today's topic, which I'll talk about in a second, we want to make sure that your questions and your comments are a part of today's conversation. We really would like for it to be interactive. So when you look at the chat option, you should see where it says all panelists and attendees. You want to make sure that you send it to both, because if you send it to only all panelists, only the three of us will be able to see it, and we want everyone to be able to benefit, because it's a community of learners and a coalition that we're building to really increase equity in our learning spaces. So please make sure you send it to all panelists and all attendees. And so for today's session, we have the pleasure of leaning into learning about accelerating the needs of English learners during a global pandemic and important considerations. We have Socorro Shiels, who's the superintendent of Sonoma Valley Unified School District. And we also have Dr. Janet Schultze, who's the superintendent of Pittsburg Unified School District. And so I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to our two facilitators today, and I will be here moderating the chat as we go along, and then I'll close this out at the end. So I'll pass it on to the two of you.
Thank you so much. Janet, if you want to start.
All right, welcome. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for spending your time with us. And Socorro and I really want this to be interactive, so please use the chat. Feel free to ask questions during it. Our slides are simple so that we can really have this as a discussion. So a little bit about Pittsburg, just for context, so you know where I am coming from. And so I have the honor of being the superintendent in Pittsburg Unified School District. This is my 6th year there. And Pittsburg is located east of the San Francisco Bay Area. So about an hour, if you were driving east, you would hit it in about an hour, right at the start of the Delta. And we have about 11,300 and some students, pre-K through 12 with adult ed. About 71% of our students are in free and reduced lunch. And then you can see our demographics. We have about 64% of our students are Latinx, about 16% African American, and then 5% each of different groups: white, Filipino, Asian, Pacific Islander. We have about 25% of our students are English learners. We had about 34% of our students as English learners a few years ago, but we have done a lot with reclassification to bring that percentage to 25%. And then we're about 10 to 11% of our students with disabilities. And so a wonderful community, very fortunate with a lot of diversity, a lot of support for education in there as well. So it's a little bit about Pittsburgh.
And a little bit about Sonoma Valley. Thank you, Janet. And thank you everyone for joining us. I want to first say to everyone, you know, thank you for everything you're doing. I know that for public education right now in this time of global pandemic, we are all innovating, creating. We're equally exhausted and excited and concerned about what we're doing and how well it's working for our students. This isn't the world we signed up for. In many ways, it's not even what we believe students need, and yet here we are, and we're trying to make the most of it for every learner. And we know that many of our learners have specific needs that are hard to meet remotely and hard to meet in other ways. A little bit about, so thank you. Thank you for working so hard, so passionately for all the students in California and wherever you might be joining us from. Sonoma Valley Unified is actually very similar to Pittsburgh, but in a different, a little further north. We're about 45 minutes north of San Francisco, and we're a smaller district. We are in Sonoma County, beautiful wine country, yet we are nestled and a little isolated. We're nestled in between Napa County, Marin County, and then a member of Sonoma County. And so we experience a lot of idea generation from different places. We have our socially economic disadvantage percentage is about 64%, English learners almost 30%, relatively few foster youth, and that might be because of accounting. That might be an error on our side or an oversight. It's kind of hard sometimes. And then we have a relatively high special ed population that we serve. And so we have a lot of diversity as well. And meeting their needs during the pandemic has been something, just as a disclaimer, and I think Janet would share, we're not hosting this because we have it figured out. We are hosting this because, like you, we believe it's incredibly important that it requires all of us working together to figure this out, and that our students deserve the best of us even now under these conditions, and their families are expecting it. So this isn't answers. In fact, it might be more questions than answers, but at least with all the synergy and the experience in the room and watching, we might be able to create together a better today and tomorrow.
So looking at our opportunities, and you know, there are opportunities. Every time there's a challenge, it's an opportunity for us to learn and to grow. And like Socorro said, you know, we are, you know, it brings us all together in this challenging times to learn from each other. And there are no quick and easy answers or solutions. What we can do is continue our commitment to public education, to serving the students, and no matter what the conditions. And so some lessons learned, we're going to share some things that were opportunities and things that are working well so far. And then we'll share things that have been challenges. And again, happy to take questions throughout. A few things, I would say in general, the biggest opportunity and sort of reminder of our why and our purpose was that what was working well and that foundation that we had before the COVID-19 and the distance learning is what has made that anything that we're doing in distance learning work at all. And that really is that relationship that our amazing teachers, admin have had with the students and with the parents. So those strong relationships with our students or English learners, you know, with all students, but in this topic in particular, has really been the foundation that has helped us with that. And so using those relationships to, and that trust to make sure that we could continue education in general. And then a few specific things that I would say that worked well, or as well as it can be, were we had students working on a few online programs prior to distance learning. And so there was a familiarity for them with that. For our students who are new to the country, we issue them a device when they're enrolled in our district anyways. and we have we have Rosetta Stone for learning English, Imagine Learning on there, so that they can use that practice at home to accelerate. And so that and then we use it with all of our students who are English learners in the school day as well. And so that familiarity, when we had the shutdown, we knew that our students who were new to the country already had the devices. And then when we did our checkout, we had to prioritize then our students who are English learners who did not have the devices. So that familiarity with the programs at least allowed them, while we were taking some time to work with teachers to say, look, you can use this every day. These are the things that your students know how to do. So the parents didn't have to know. The students already knew how to do the login and access that. So that was one of the things. And I'll share some others, but we'll just take some turns sharing some things.
Thank you. So for us, and I'm sure for many of you, the pandemic was like this sudden jolt of transformation and totally rocked us. And so what it required in ways we had not been really asked to do before was that we as a district, so all the teachers, all the principals, really got together and talked about what's possible, what do we have the tools for. Of course, like everyone else, we worked on making sure that people had, that families and students all had the device and the Wi-Fi access. But then moving on to instruction, what does that look like? And what are we going to do in this kind of limited context? Because we think of learning as such a richer experience, such a different experience. And so what will we do in this context of just receiving information? And what does that look like, both for our high school English learners, but our littles, our young ones who, in our district, we had one-to-one devices in secondary, but young ones only used their devices at school. So families weren't used to it, but now we have this opportunity. How are we as third grade? How are we as science at middle school going to think about this and how we do learning? So we had a lot more meetings. I mean, it's one of the kind of Zoom pluses, I guess, that everybody could meet together and have these conversations about what's meaningful to us. So there were new ways for our professionals to collaborate and calibrate about what was possible in ways we really haven't done before, except perhaps a single day when we all got together in the middle of the year, which those are great, but they're so few and far between that this crisis created an urgency to do more of that. And then one of the things I hear about, I have been hosting remote lunches with me on Wednesdays, and they've been so well attended, and I'm so thankful to hear from all staff perspectives what's working and what's not. But one of the things that I've been impressed with is the creativity that is being forced and unlocked, and people are leaning into it about how do we make this exciting? How do I film myself? And of course, we weren't talking about that in January, but how do I film myself? What does an intro look like? How do I do all of that and make it engaging for students? Because this has not been our medium before. How do I meet the needs of English learners who need to hear and practice? And we know learning is that ZPD, right? Your zone +1. It is a stretch. It's meant to be a stretch beyond what's comfortable. How do we account for that in this condition for learners like English learners who have specific learning needs that aren't necessarily embedded in every program? Janet mentioned some very specific ones for English learner development, but some of the programs we might have had might not be tailored for them. And I know that was the case for some of us. Not that it couldn't be helpful, but it's not tailored. And so that opportunity to speak together, not that we had all the answers about that, but to bring it up and dive in and be together in finding a solution, be curious together, that was a great opportunity for us as well. Pass it back to you, Janet.
Yeah, I think the dialogue and that opportunity when you're in a crisis situation, it moves the conversation in a different way instructionally. We had teachers who then we did have, who needed to become much more comfortable and familiar in the online world as well, as we all did. With our families, some of the other things we did was that relationship piece and continued our DLAC meetings, our District English Language Advisory Committee for English Learner Families. I'm not sure all the acronyms, if they're the same across all the different states with that. So, having that group of parents continue to meet was very important. They're a group of parents who has taken a lot of time to be educated about our district, our budget. So getting their opinion was vital, and keeping that connection was really helpful for us as well too. Doing some parent workshops to help them, that was an opportunity. It was really interesting. We have dual immersion in our going up through our elementary schools. Two of our 8 elementary schools have dual immersions, and then and then 2 of our junior high schools, and then in the high school it goes more into the honors, advanced placement, Spanish, mostly because of not being able to find the staff with the content knowledge. But in the elementary school with the dual immersion, what was really fascinating with the parents was we had all of these English speaking parents saying, oh, how can I help my child with their homework? And it was a great opportunity to say, what do you think it's like for our parents who are Spanish speaking as their first language or as their only language in the household? So it was a great opportunity to bring some awareness for the families in our dual immersion program as well too. It's a challenge, but it's a great opportunity. And then there's been some creativity, not system-wide implementation, but great ideas come of that, where a teacher then is like, okay, I'm going to bring some parents together for homework help time, or try and do some things that are creative with Zoom. Things that we could have done in person before, right? But never really set the structure up. And so I think there was some freeing of the creativity, to Socorro's point, that really brought that out in our educators. And that was a great opportunity. And so we're trying to make sure that we capture those and don't lose that for the future as well.
In Sonoma Valley, we have 9 schools, 5 different elementaries, and they are in very specific parts of town. And sometimes I think not all staff understand how different in one single community that isn't that large. We're about 50,000 if you include the whole amount of people living in the valley. Might not understand how different, even in kind of this small area, we might live life. And so I think that what Janet was talking about, like sharing context, I found that to also be an opportunity for us to talk about how different some of our neighborhoods are, our little micro communities, so that people understand when we say, even expressing our own reality, our own lived experience of this pandemic isn't everybody's, and being open to understanding that different people are experiencing different things in this crisis. While it can take us down kind of a perhaps a negative little road, it is an opportunity to see who we are and understand what our assets are, and understand how our differences aren't necessarily a weakness, but just a reality that we have to understand as we seek to solve for all. That like an individual issue at a school might be replicated or might not be replicated across the district, and understanding that more acutely, I think, makes us stronger as a district to understand who all of us are. We have 5 elementaries, 2 middles, and a single high school. So they all go one place together, and understanding that education at all these different schools that feed into them, the more similar they are in terms of meeting students, having the same expectations, getting to the high school prepared, that's really stronger for everyone. And we all believe that. As we met more, we're able to talk about that specifically. We're able to bring it down specifically to the experiences we're creating for students, what that means, what that looks like. And like Janet mentioned, like no one really had answers. Like in a week, we had to change everything, right? So even one of the things that I think has been wonderful for our staff as well, and I'm so proud of the way in which they've kind of, again, just leaned into it and found steadiness and confidence, is how do we assess how students are doing in this medium? How do we understand what's going on and how students are learning? And there isn't a single answer. Again, this wasn't the world we had been prepared for, either through school or any of that, our own schooling, our professional experiences. But I know that teachers are working, administrators are working, our classified staff and support staff are all working like doubly hard to figure out how can we figure out and see learning, encourage learning, support more learning, in this effort and for our English learners. And so I think that is like another blessing that came from all of this. And, you know, as people holding the conversations, I think it's really critical that we keep bringing up, even in the midst of a global pandemic, all the things that went right, all the things that, despite the hardships that were thrown our way, that were surprising to all of us, that have taken us aback, that we are able to step into this for students, that public education is here to educate students, our staffs, we will figure it out, even with one hand tied behind our back, a blindfold on, and somebody spinning us around like it's like pin the tail on the donkey. Like, we still keep coming. We're like the Terminator. We keep coming and keep trying to educate students. And I think that is very encouraging for all of us in public education. Then
I saw a few questions pop up, but I didn't catch them. So maybe we could take a couple. I saw there were a few questions in the chat.
Yep, I'm happy to go back to the beginning and work through those. All right, so the first question that I see is, what did you do for the social emotional context area for scholars and families?
Yeah, you know, it's never enough, but what we did was a combination of things. So on the students who were receiving therapy services, we were able to continue that. So we worked with our contracted provider and made sure that they were able to, and then had to do the practical things around, you know, the parents giving permission to do it via Zoom or phone to continue those therapy sessions as well. And then we did trying some unique things. We have some restorative justice facilitators in the district, and they led some sessions and some circles for all. We also have a grant where we were doing some mindfulness training at a couple schools. And when we had to go to distance learning, we worked with that grant provider to switch, you know, instead of working at 2 specific schools, to provide some services across the district. So we do those in English and in Spanish, where we have opportunities for scholars, for families, for teachers to come together and learn some stress management, mindfulness techniques that are really important for that. We have parent and family liaisons. They were very critical in this time. Again, that relationship piece, because they were able to outreach to check on the families. And then as we did our sort of collection of data of students that we were in contact with, we also were keeping up with the students that we were unable to be in contact with. And our student services department then was able to do more specific outreach to really try our best to locate those families. Sometimes that would our families who were homeless, some of our foster youth, to make sure that they were okay, that they had resources or were aware of the community resources, and that they had the devices, things of that nature. So those are a few of the things. As we think about coming back, you know, opening school in the fall, that's first and foremost, because we, on our minds, because we know that the transition back for everyone is going to be emotional, and for our staffs as well too. And keeping in mind, how are we going to start a school year in whatever format we're in person, online, distance, blended, you know, who knows right now.
all of the above.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know, but making sure that we start with the social emotional and doing guided lessons on expressing feelings, you know, at the different levels. It's, you know, it's extremely important. So those are a few of the things that we're doing and thinking about.
I would second what Janet said. We did a lot of the same. We immediately started a warm line that our counselors could be available, and others, like we have a couple social workers from a grant that they could be available to help families and help point them in the right direction to other community resources, and got that out in English and Spanish. We also you know, used different mediums like Janet and Pittsburg Unified. We tried to also follow and track down people who weren't attending, like if there were families. So we had schools calling, we had the liaisons calling, we had everybody calling and trying to figure out like what's going on. And I think similar to what Janet said, we understand that this social emotional need of staff and students for all of our families is going to be a huge issue to address. Kind of only seeing the tip of the iceberg, you know, for every family email that I got, like, we're not doing enough, we need to do more for academically. I also got emails from parents like, are you kidding me? I can barely handle this. I don't know how I'm expected to do this. And when we look and think about our challenges, certainly the trauma and hidden trauma that we don't even know about, right? Because it's happening at home. We usually can mitigate some things because they're with us all day. So we understand the context and their setting and it's similar and shared. But when they're at home, we understand all those cards are off the table and we don't exactly know what's going on, nor can we change some of it, right? So that, I think, is definitely something we're all thinking of. The issue of familiarity on the slide, not all families, and particularly English learner families, were as familiar with technology at all. So where we went to immediate communication, this is the Sonoma Valley, where we went to immediate communication in emails and online, because that's what was available. You know, in the past, we at schools do hard copies and send them home. Of course, everything's in Spanish, but parents weren't used to receiving emails and weren't used to emails as a form of communication. Many of our Spanish-speaking families, their emails are really only to register students. So we had to learn more about Facebook, get on Facebook, get things posted that way, get on some town halls that other people were hosting. We could, you know, do all Spanish Q&As and get answers. Figure out, were there ways to give people hard copy information when they're picking up homework packets or when they're picking up food. So what we had relied on in terms of normal communication wasn't good enough. And we had to figure out what we are always trying to figure out. What more can we do to get families, meet families where they are, to get them the critical information they need? So that familiarity with technology also then rolls into learning, again, particularly for our small ones. Of course, it requires that a parent's by their side helping them navigate certain things. And it's different when the student is accustomed to that. So we had devices for third grade up. So some students were used to logging on and all of those things, not with their parents, but definitely by themselves. But we made the decision to go TK up, everyone one-to-one with a device at home. And that certainly isn't something that students were familiar with, nor were necessarily parents. So we had to think about creating videos in Spanish. Still over the summer, we're looking at, are there ways we can do small, safely appropriate classes for parents to learn more about technology so they feel confident as a partner, so they feel they have familiarity. And like everyone else in the state, connectivity at home is an issue. We certainly have families who in the past, when they had things, they might go to the library, they might go to a restaurant or another location, public location, where there was free Wi-Fi, and we had to change that. We had to make sure that families right now, when it was so critical to our method and mode of delivery, that families had access. And we were able to work out some things locally and spend district dollars and get donations so that families that needed Wi-Fi hotspots were able to get it. But even then, like the depth of the bandwidth and uploading video now, which is like a normal transmission of information, video requires more bandwidth. And is it strong enough? Can we get it in different parts of our community? We can have a little bit rural, we have a little bit more highly dense and populated. So those were the types of challenges that we're still working through, and we're trying to find the opportunities to do better in all of them. But they for sure were issues that that we probably, if we had time, would have seen coming, but it became clearer and clearer in the midst of kind of rolling things out, like, wow, our communication, people aren't used to emails. And we hadn't noticed that we'd stripped away other modes of communication, like the Friday folders that go home, for example, with little ones, where things get tucked in and people can read them. Without that, there was a gap we had to seek to fill.
Do you want me to go on to the next question? Thank you so much for your response there. All right, so another question here is, how did you facilitate teacher training and instructional materials for distance learning?
So with teacher training, we relied on Zoom. Zoom became definitely what we ended up using for everything. And then a lot of switch to Google as well. So again, it accelerated what we were sort of dipping our toes into as a district. It accelerated that. We had certain levels that were using it more than others. So we used those. So we did trainings on the distance learning part first with our staff and trying to make sure that they were comfortable with Google Classroom, with Zoom and the basics of Zoom, how to make the settings on Zoom secure. So to limit, anyone else coming into your Zoom for the training. So those were some of the main things that we did for the teachers in terms of getting that together. The schools, we have 8 elementaries, 3 junior highs, and then 1 comprehensive high school, 1 continuation high school, and then adult ed. And then our pre-K is embedded in our elementary schools. So in our schools, then the school principals would lead different trainings with their staffs as well too. So people had choices to opt into trainings with some district office staff, and then schools had some specific ones as well too, really relying on Zoom. And then the other part of the question, I'm sorry, was it instructional materials? Was that?
The part of the question, let me go back up to the question. I had to scroll down. So the next question to get ready. It was about teacher training and instructional materials for distance learning. Yep.
Yeah, instructional materials. So a couple of things. When we made the decision to close school, it was Friday, March 13th. And so I did an emergency board meeting very early in that morning so that we could get information out to the schools by noon and to the families so that, and at that time we thought, oh, maybe 2 weeks or so, but we messaged out to take your books home with you. And so we did have a number of our scholars or students took the books home with them. So that helped. We had to check out devices, and that was a huge challenge for us. We're not a one-to-one district. We did not receive donations. I was in San Francisco for a number of years, and but nobody was pulling up in their truck to Pittsburgh saying, here's your donation of, 1,000 Chromebooks. So we did a big order right away, and did a survey. So we did a survey for our families to see who had something at home. And we went from there and tried to make sure that we got everyone something who needed one. Connectivity remains a challenge with that. And then we did some packets. So we, during our meal service delivery time, we handed out some packets, and for our students who are English learners and our students who are in the dual immersion, we had them available there as well too. So when the families were coming through to pick up their the meals, they could pick up learning packets as well. We did some old school mailing home for some. For the very little, we did some kits, like little pre-K kits, and I think we'll be doing our 3rd one right now, where it's maybe some books and some Play-Doh and some different activities to do for that. So that's how we handled those 2 things. And I would say our biggest challenge in instructional materials was really the devices.
I think we were a little different. We had a little headway on the devices. So connectivity was an issue, and that slowed us down a little bit, but secondary, teachers were very familiar, mostly familiar, secondary, particularly with Google Classrooms and how to use all of that. So that was a leading edge. I think for our elementary, it was a lot of learning, and we did a lot of our PD. And I think we've done a tremendous effort, but I just am not sure we all learn this way. We did, teaching remote learning remotely. And, we as adults, I think, are much more used to interactive, real-time learning conditions. So while I think people have done a great job, I look forward to when we can return to all being together and learn together, even these things. I think our learning materials, so again, we had computer devices out. Most people had books. I think we were not as able to, and thinking about how we do this over the summer and for the new year, get materials in the hands of littles so that there were more things they could do at home, because so much of it is a shared learning experience with their parents and other things. You know, how we help create that and how we can create more level learning opportunities for everyone, no matter what's going on at home. And so we're going to continue to strive to do that. We had looked into at one point, like, you know, everything pops up online sometimes. Now during the pandemic, you can pretty much order anything and get it delivered relatively, except everybody's doing the same thing. So inventories for things are low, but we had seen where you could order some kits and they'd be delivered, and we were hoping to do that, but I think we missed a window when they were available and things like that. So kind of trying to understand the different resources like that. I do appreciate, as again, a profession here in California, I know that many circles have collaborated more. So when a colleague, a fellow superintendent, anyone else in another district hears about something, we are sharing ideas, and we that has been very helpful. So not everybody has to recreate the wheel. We did the same thing in terms of packets in English and Spanish available when food was available for pickup, so that there was routine and consistency that way. And I think, you know, I think probably across the state, we all wish we did better with ELD all the time, let alone during a pandemic. And so it definitely is something on our radar and that we're striving to do. We this year, you know, at the end of this year, we went through an adoption, a new adoption for our K-5, ELD, ELA. And so right now, our great ed services and our teacher leaders are thinking about, well, how will we bring this in if we start the school year, either distance learning or only part-time? I mean, there are demands from the curriculum about how often you use it, how long you use it during the day, for it to be as robust as it should be for learners. And how are we going to do that? And were any of them, probably not, were any of them ready to be kind of used online, and what that will look like? So that's a challenge lying ahead of us as well. We might now have the best ELD materials in the brick and mortar school we've ever had. How do we translate that to distance learning? How do we use those materials remotely? How do we think about learning in developmentally appropriate ways? So for our third grader, who we don't want to have more screen time than perhaps 15 to 20 minutes at best, at a sitting, how do we create engaging opportunities for a third grader who's also an English learner, for a third grader who might be an English learner and have an IEP? Right. And I think teachers are struggling in the most creative way possible to create those learning conditions. We learned, for example, especially for our younger ones, but also for our older students, yes, there's a great time to do whole class instruction, probably limited, and where more bang for the buck comes instructionally is in smaller groups. So how do we schedule those? What do they look like? How do we make sure those are happening? Because we would be doing that in real time. We would have small groups that were similar, homogeneous or heterogeneous. How would we do that? How do we do that online? And how do we make that time as rich as possible? Although we understand it would pale to in real time. So I think those are some of the challenges that we're working on in terms of material and PD. I think we've done a great job, but I think some of our adult learners need something different.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. This is actually something I've been thinking about too. And one of the participants asked about how should we approach supports for the fall when there's like transition happening. So the question in particular was about like everyone being new to middle school, but I'm thinking that's true for like any transition, like going from elementary to middle or middle to high. Like, what do either of you have thoughts about like what supports would look like for our students who are acquiring English in particular, or just in general, as they're transitioning from one level to another?
I love that as a profession we're thinking about things like that, because I think those are exactly the points, like we had talked about, all of us, that we understand there's going to be higher levels of trauma, But imagine going into a new school and a new class, both for our adults and students. These aren't people they know. The one thing about the, crazy pandemic was that it was closer to the end of the year. So the teacher and the learner knew one another, knew one another's personality, expectations, kind of more or less where they were in the world and all of that. And now we'll have TK students coming to school for the first time. We'll have our transition as 5th to 6th grade. We'll have 6th graders in a new learning context, switching classes where we're used to having one teacher. I mean, those type of things are going to be, and then of course, 8th to 9, those climbing years, which are hard anyway, those transition years are difficult in real time. And so I love that we're thinking about it. I don't know that we have answers. I read somewhere that some state, I don't think it was California, but that they were actually focusing on those transition years and prioritizing them as the first to come back. Understanding, again, Janet started with relationships, right? How are we going to form the deep relationships necessary for learning just online? It's really going to be a challenge for us. If it all starts with distance learning, I think it'll make so many people uncomfortable because it's philosophically not what we believe and how we believe these relationships should exist. So, I mean, we will do our best, as we always do in public education, to carry on, but it will change the way we interact with students, and we know that. But I love that we're thinking about it, and I would love to hear great ideas and suggestions, because it will be a critical point. Families are going to need it from us. They're going to be they're going to be wanting to support their child, and so again, families we know that aren't as used to the system in the States and kind of when those transition points are and how the expectations change, how the kind of daily schedule changes, they're going to need our help. And one of the things we've started doing more of is making little vignettes, little videos, not perfect, not beautiful, but like whether it's recording ourselves on Zoom or me literally sitting in my office recording myself on like my phone camera for 3 minutes at a time to get videos out in English and Spanish to parents or staff about what's going on. And I just think we're going to have to do more and more and more of that if these are the conditions we're still in.
Right.
Yeah. So I was going to say, did you want me to keep going with questions, or did you want to go back to your presentation?
Well, I think that kind of the advocating, these are things kind of probably that'll come up in the questions, because we're all in the same situation and we all kind of know what we need to keep moving forward. So maybe we answer the questions and Janet can take the next one.
Okay. All right. So this next question is, how are we ensuring that dual identified students with, if the word is disabilities, I have such a hard time, like, who are differently able, that's feeling more comfortable for me, or in English learners are included with gen ed and receiving services?
That's a great question. And I think that's something that everyone struggles with when we're in person as well as distance. So I think like everything else, we do our best and we look at it. So in terms of things that we're doing, again, it's looking at where's the relationship, what's the individual need of that child. And so if it ends up, so a lot depends on what services the student is getting. We've arranged to apply to be able to provide services as much as possible through remote. So for example, at a speech language, we may have our speech language pathologist do a group with 2 or 3 students at a time through Zoom to work on specific words for vocabulary and for pronunciation. Like Socorro, we're creating videos. Some of our teachers are fantastic at doing some of this video lessons and going through and describing that. So we're working on that as well too. And but really just looking at what's in the IEP, what are the individual students' needs, and how do we do our best in this time to make sure that we're meeting those needs. Just like we would, it's different because it's remote, but that's how we approached it, is really looking at, okay, each individual child is going to have their needs. What are the services? How are we going to make sure that we can give a remote version of those services to continue in place. In terms of with Gen Ed, we hope that happens in our classes, but not every child is attending the Zoom class at the same time. So that's a concern, because we do have families with different schedules and all of that. So that's a concern. I think it's a concern for all of our scholars across the board, for our students who are English learners, also because they're not getting that experience with language acquisition in the same way if they're not able to attend the classes and doing that as well too. So really trying to make sure that there's a lot of outreach. But in general, for that specific question, it is looking at the needs of the individual child and then going through and saying, okay, how are we going to meet this? So with our providers, for example, if we have some of our speech language pathologists who are our district employees, we have some who are contracted services, probably like many of you. And so we had to have conversations early on. If you want to continue to get paid as a contracted provider, you have to provide these services remotely, or we're not gonna, or that's it. So people responded pretty quickly when that was for it to meet those needs as well too.
Thank you. Socorro, were you gonna say something?
I think that's, again, I love that we're thinking about that as educators, because I think that's kind of like the holy grail. If we could do it, if we could make learning right for that student, we'd really be like at the top of our game. And I think we're all striving to do that, but in so many ways, I think we know that, students with that specific and specialized and a learning need, that remotely is like not usually it. And so just hearing Janet talk, I was thinking about, for our English learners in particular, and we know like the 4 domains of language, and part of what students need to do is negotiate speaking. It is like so critical. And in this world, that's missing, because I'm speaking like right now, I'm speaking and nobody, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. And so like our students are missing that, and we are asking them to use the chat rooms, and we are learning how to use like in Zoom breakout rooms and more things like that. But that smaller group instruction we found to be critical, and that's not where our plan started. That's not how we had organized it. And that does mean a trade-off for something else, because the school day is still just the school day. And so where we used to be able to do those small groups simultaneously, that's not how it looks anymore. And so what are the advantages and trade-offs for all of that? And going back to the IEP, I think every special ed teacher in the state and probably across this nation has done amazing things to try and translate what they do in the classroom to this remote world. And it's not an easy transition. And so, prioritizing that students get the devices they need, and if there are different programs they need, can we figure that out? Do they even exist? What would that look like? Students who need it one-to-one aids, what does that look like now, and how is that helpful? And how do we figure all of that out? We're still in stages. Again, the disclaimer from the beginning, we have not figured it all out, and we are looking like the rest of you for better ways, better solutions, and more resources, hopefully from the state and federal levels, that allow us to do more.
Yeah. It's challenging, and for the parents, I really feel, because when they don't have that time of the school day, and they have this full time now and juggling, and we try to send home like kits with especially for our students who are on the spectrum, things with like widgets and things that they used in the classrooms and their pads to help make that more familiarity at the home as well too. But it is very, very challenging, I think, as we prioritize, what learning looks like and those transitions coming back, thinking about how we're going to be able to do as much in person as we're allowed and, able to do, and with our students who need it the most is going to be very critical. As we think about transitions, and just what that looks like, it's going to be really critical to apply that equity lens on there and have those conversations openly and honestly. So our families with the loudest voice may not be the ones who need the services the most. And we have to really make sure you know, we're not going to have the resources to do everything for everyone, and prioritizing what that looks like is going to be incredibly important to have that equity lens in the front and center of all of this, especially as it applies to, you know, English language learners and the additional supports they're going to need in their language acquisition and anything that they've missed during this time.
Thank you for that. The next question is something I think that I've definitely heard this conversation already about, you know, how when we have students online, how are we monitoring for engagement? And so this question is, how do we check for engagement with EL students through distance learning to make sure that when they are able to get on and be in the, you know, in the learning space on Zoom or whatever other platform they might be using, how are instructors monitoring for engagement for them?
Yeah.
I think, you know, I wish I had a great answer. I think it's about, I think a lot of what we had to switch to thinking about, and again, we're only in process, not saying we've arrived, but what does mastery look like, and how do we know, and what do we want to see, and what does that look like? Because we miss in this medium so much of the learning process, right? And so I don't think that we have it solved, but engagement has been like on what we're getting back. And I don't know if it's as much engagement in the learning lesson, although like, you know, the usual call and response, but it's certainly not enough in a whole class experience. Again, we have been trying to find those office hours and small group sessions for the young ones to make sure that we are kind of seeing and hearing every little voice or older voice, and hearing and seeing their thought process, right? That metacognition is something that as educators, we value being able to see students work through their problem solving and their learning process. And so I don't think we have it figured out. We have been, again, in being flexible. We know many of our students went to work. We know that lots of things happened so that families could be supported. And so in giving flexibility, we also lose some of our opportunity to gauge. So like what we haven't figured out is if we're doing the video, but you're not here, but we recorded it and you can watch it on your own time. Like, I don't know that we have figured out. Like, I don't know for sure if you watched the video. Maybe you didn't need to because you could do the assignment without it. But those types of things we haven't figured out. If it was scheduled for 9:30 and you report to work at 9, and we gave flexibility in the way we created our schedule so that could happen. If you in your assignment, we are taking that as being engaged. If we got to talk to you through email or other things, we're taking that as being engaged. However, that's not the same thing as really being able to monitor your learning like we do when it's in person. And so we are still figuring that whole continuum out.
Yeah, exactly. It's incredibly challenging, you know, and because you don't have those in-person interactions to do those informal assessments that teachers do every day. That's gone. And so even over the Zoom, the teachers are, you know, trying to do so much in one period of time with that. I think it depends on the level as well, too. One thing that we are using, but it only measures a certain level of engagement, is with the online. We do run regular reports to see how the usage that the students are using. And then for our designated EL, for elementary students, we use how students are doing. And in our case, it's Imagine Learning that we use. And then the teachers take those reports. And then that's when they then group the students to provide the smaller group instruction to try and do some semblance of a designated ELD time at the elementary level is another way that we sort of monitor usage for engagement.
Thank you both for that. There's another question in, but I think it's similar to what we just talked about, even though it's different. You've addressed it a bit, and I'll give voice to it just so you know. But one of the questions is, please address how you're handling giving students grades for both those who attended distance learning or participated in distance learning and those who didn't. I don't know if you wanted to say more about that, you know, so I'll leave it open to both of you if you wanted to say more about grading in particular, even though you've already talked a bit about the challenge with assessing in this circumstance.
I'll say this, because I think it's been a topic in our community. We actually went credit, no credit for the final semester or trimester, based on kind of all of these unpredictable variables that we just talked about, that we don't know what it looks like in the home, how parents are able to assist, what kind of regular connectivity looks like at home, and all of those things. And it's been a kerfuffle, quite honestly. And I think that one of the things as we move into the fall, where we believe we'll go back to more normal grading procedures and processes, is how do we get feedback to students? Because grading is kind of the most summative feedback about how students are doing. And we're trying to do that, again, in real time. We do that all the time. So not just assignments, but the students are getting feedback about their learning. So how in this world do we give feedback about how students are learning so it can add up to a grade that makes sense? And how are we being both flexible and equitable and understanding, but also engaging and motivating and moving students forward and giving them a sense of how they're doing in all of this, so we don't lose them and they don't like, oh, I've already got this, I don't need to do anymore. And they're not coming in with a minimum, but rather stretching and growing. So I don't know that we have an answer, but I do know we're going to have to understand more about giving feedback to students, both on assignments, but also on their learning, so that they can then become masters of the choices they're making, particularly our older students. And our parents at every level, certainly the younger students, need feedback so they understand what's working and not, especially if we're in this distance world, right? So if we're asking them to be partners, they need information too, to be making right and appropriate decisions for their children. And so I think grading is one of those that's where it's still a work in progress. We want to use it to motivate students and not harm them. I mean, all of those things that came out with the guidance from the state, even though it was very squishy. We don't want to harm students for living in a pandemic, but students to learn because we believe learning is critical for our democracy. And so how do we create those conditions that allow both to happen simultaneously? Again, I don't think we have all the answers, but those are the types of conversations we're having with parents, with staff, with community leaders, so that we all understand why it's difficult to talk about this and why normal isn't normal right now.
Yeah, just real quick on the grading thing, and we did credit, no credit for the secondary, and then for the elementary, we did met expectations, and then the other choice was little to no contact. And so that way the teacher for the next year will know, you know, where that child was in terms of during the distance learning time. We're spending concentrated efforts in our transition years to do the online version of a CUME folder. So we've asked our teachers to, if you think about all the things you fill out with more detailed information, that our teachers are doing that, really focusing on the transition years, because when they go to that other school, although we're the same district, it's a whole other world. So, and then of course the goal is to do it for all of the students, but really focusing on the transition years and doing a virtual or a digital. We just took basically some of those things you put in the CUME folder, especially in the elementary school where we have standards-based grading and there's more of the comments that are very important to go. So that's what we're doing for that, even though it's their official grade is met or little or no contact. They then put some more detailed information in that for the receiving teacher. If it's,
yeah. That's so key, right? I mean, I was like, all these things you bring, I'm like, that's right. Because I started out as an elementary, the 4th and then 5th grade teacher. And I'm like, right, the cumulative folder, like, yeah, so many things to consider. Absolutely. Well, I really want to, first of all, just say thank you to the two of you for facilitating such a helpful, informative session and for creating and holding this space for all of us. I will, like I mentioned in the beginning of our time together, I'm going to be dropping in 3 links for everyone as participants. The first link is going to be, I'm dropping it in right now, is the link to the survey for today's session. So you should just have received a bit.ly link. And please, please, please do give us your feedback because we do genuinely take it seriously. the next piece I'm going to put through, a next link is the Ask the Experts portal that I mentioned. That if that's, so a couple of questions come through toward the end that we won't have time to engage with today, but please do go ahead and submit those questions to the Ask the Experts portal, because that's, you'll be able to have someone engage with you about your concerns and ideas. So it's not just about question asking. I think, like we've talked about a bit in this session, is that even asking the question is about, even if we don't have an answer, it's important to ask the question so that we are considering all the different components that we need to be mindful of. And then the last link is what I mentioned earlier about being able to have today's resources. So if you're, so many of you are just like, oh, this is so helpful. If you want to see it again, or if you want to share with colleagues or family members and things like that, this last link that I just put through gives you a link to the website where you'll be able to find the recording for today's session and also today's session resources. So again, thank you so much for facilitating a marvelous session, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.
And I just want to thank all the educators in California for doing amazing work for the students here. We know, we see, as kind of people with you in the trend, we see everything you're doing. We see you, and it's amazing and it's inspiring. And keep at it, and thank you.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so much, and hang in there, and know that the work that you do makes such a difference in your scholars' lives. I mean,
Absolutely.
no one ever feels like you're doing enough, but what you're doing is making a huge difference, and that connection you have is so important, in especially those of you who are having the direct connection with your students and every day. And I know it's emotional for you too. And so just know, we, like Socorro said, we see it, we know it, and we just appreciate it so much.
And thank you, CAAASA and CCEE.
Thank you, CAAASA. Yeah.
For caring about the children in our state. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, CAAASA, for always having these really interesting opportunities to engage in a real way with people.
And remember, we do this for students. So thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. And thanks to everyone. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.